This story just keeps getting worse and worse. If I fell over right now into this disgusting slime, there is a risk of liver damage, nerve damage, brain damage, severe illness, and worst case scenario, death. This disgusting mess has been linked to the deaths of multiple dogs here over the last few years, and it's also killed horses, cattle, birds, and fish. Ugh, it looks like green diarrhea, but this is blue-green algae, and this contains and produces harmful toxins, and it's also been found to contain over 13 different microbes that cause illness in humans, including Salmonella and E. coli. It is truly, truly vile. So the risk to people mostly comes from actual physical contact. So while I'm here in my welly boots, I'm probably okay, although I wouldn't want to stand here breathing this air in for too long. But if I was to reach down and scoop up handfuls of it and start smearing it on my skin, or perish the thought, accidentally ingest some of it, by tomorrow morning I would be turning myself inside out with vomiting and diarrhea. I could have a rash starting to develop on my skin, and I was starting to develop breathing difficulties. And speaking of breathing difficulties, the smell here is absolutely disgusting. It's foul, absolutely foul. The easiest way to describe this is that it smells of a combination of gas, sewage, and a dead, rotten animal. It is disgusting. It is the stench of death and filth. It just drips some on my thumb. Oh, my hand actually smells like I stuck it in dog poo. I need to wash my hands. The thing is, this story is much, much worse, because this is not just an isolated patch of sludge, because the entirety of Lough Neagh, the largest freshwater lake in Ireland, anywhere in the UK, it's 3 times the size of Dublin or Manchester, has almost entirely turned green. It's an absolute ecological disaster, and this is the story of how it was also completely avoidable.
Isle has an ecological problem of apocalyptic proportions.
The loch is near death. We're saying it's dying. It's not dying of natural causes, by the way. It's been killed. It's been killed.
If these green-eyed blues would lighten up, if my nature would shake this wicked spell, if this midnight sky would brighten up, if my ears could hear a voice saying, all will be well, then all is well, all is well. I once was found, but now again I'm lost. On merciless waves I am tossed. I would tell you of his grace and how it was I fell, but some tales are just too dark to tell.
Blue-green algae has been found on the north coast, an increase in the potentially toxic...
Ew, it smells so bad here. That is disgusting. Right, when these massive algae blooms sort of appeared for what seemed like the first time last summer, people were angry, confused, and frustrated and upset that such a thing could be allowed to happen in 2023. But something I noticed was that in a lot of the news articles about this, every now and then, at some point it would say, since the 1970s, the worst algae since the 1970s, but nobody actually addressed what actually happened in the 1970s. They just said it as if it meant something that we should all understand. So I decided to investigate this a little bit further, and I went back and looked in newspaper archives, and actually this goes back much further than the 1970s. I went right back to the 1950s, where this all started with a man just trying to enjoy his retirement. That man was called William Rogers, and William and his wife moved into Bridge House in Soldierstown along the Lough Canal. This was about 6 miles from where the Lough Canal emptied into Lough Neagh, and it seemed like the perfect place to enjoy their retirement. William spent his days working in his garden or fishing for pike in the canal, and they quite often caught 8 to 10 pound pike, which is at least a good sign of reasonably healthy water. Unfortunately, their idyllic retirement was somewhat cut short, and it was cut short by horrendous smell. A horrendous smell which was coming from the canal. A thick green sludge had developed on the surface of the canal. It was killing local wildlife, and it created a smell so bad it aggravated William's asthma enough to put him in hospital. That canal that William thought would be a great place to retire beside, it was no longer being used for transport purposes, so it seems that a local pig farm and maybe some other industries started using it as a way to get rid of waste effluent. This waste was polluting the canal, and as far as William was concerned, was the source of the horrible green sludge that was ruining his retirement, and he continued to complain for several years until eventually, fed up, he went to the newspaper, local newspaper in 1967 and declared, "I have complained about this until I am sick, and now I intend to raise as big a stink as there is in that water." And William's fantastic tactics seemed to have worked, because in September of that year, the government admitted there was a problem and promised an investigation. The person put in charge of the investigation was a scientist called Roger Smith. And by 1973, they had their answer. They figured out that this green sludge, this blue-green algae in Lough Neagh, was caused by an excess of nutrients, and in particular, an excess of phosphate. Back then it was about 20% of it was coming from agriculture, and the other 80% of it was coming from industry. They made recommendations on how to reduce the levels going into the loch, and groups were set up to monitor it so they would know when levels were getting too high. So 50 years ago, they knew what caused this, they knew how to monitor it, they knew how to predict it, and they knew how to prevent it. So the thing that makes me angry is, why 50 years later was this allowed to happen? And the answer, as I found, was a combination of bad luck, unforeseen circumstances, selfishness, greed, willful ignorance, a lack of funding, and a very, very healthy dose of political incompetence. On a day like today, you might be fooled into thinking there wasn't actually a problem on the loch, because from where I'm standing, I can't really see any algae. The wind has got up, it's created waves, and that's broken up the algae and sort of washed it out into the loch. But once you get an aerial perspective, that reveals another story, because you can see that the algae is simply broken up into these clouds, which are now floating around the loch. But this is maybe a good time to answer the question of what actually is blue-green algae, because as I said earlier, it's not an algae, it's actually a bacteria, and it's a type of bacteria known as a cyanobacteria. Cyan means blue, hence blue-green algae. It's an entirely naturally occurring bacteria, but in the right or perhaps wrong conditions, it can multiply massively and create these huge blooms, such as what we're seeing on Lough Neagh. So while blue-green algae is natural, massive blooms like this are not. This almost always requires human interference. And this is the same stuff that they've been having problems with in England, in the Lake District on Lake Windermere. In that case, a irresponsible water company has been dumping too much sewage into the lake, and it's causing those blooms. And there's a few other factors involved as well as the excess of nutrients. You also need really calm conditions, warmth, and because the cyanobacteria that forms the algae reproduces using photosynthesis, you also need an abundance of sunlight. And that brings me to the 7 factors, yes, 7 factors that led to the Lough Neagh algae crisis. Probably the weirdest contributing factor we have to talk about is the Russian invasion, and I don't mean that Russian invasion, I mean this Russian invasion, because if you walk along the shores of Lough Neagh, you might notice that in some places the ground is completely covered by these white and brown shells. And it's not just the surface is covered. That is a pile 20 centimeters deep of these shells, and it's not just in this spot, it is everywhere. They are piled up in mounds, they've been washed up during the winter, and these shouldn't be here, because these are Russian zebra mussels. It's an invasive species. It probably came in on an imported boat or something like that. They first appeared here in 2005, and since then the population has exploded, and they're everywhere in Lough Neagh. There are millions of them, maybe more. And the problem with these mussels is that they're filter feeders. So they filter and eat particles in the water, and in doing so they make the water clearer. And when they make the water clear, that means that sunlight can penetrate down into the water better. And what's that good for? Blue-green algae. And the worst thing about the zebra mussels is that we have completely lost the battle. They're here to stay, and there's absolutely nothing anybody can do about it. Next, we have the fact that the temperature in Lough Neagh has been rising, and over the last about 30 years, the temperature has risen by 1 degree Celsius. And that might not sound like a lot, but it makes a big difference when it comes to something like blue-green algae. And in the summer last year, when we would have expected surface temperatures to be around 15 degrees, they actually peaked at 21 Celsius. It's very unlikely that those temperatures are going to go down again, and in all likelihood, they're only going to increase. Okay, I finally found what I'm looking for, because this small grey pipe here is a treated discharge pipe. In this case, this pipe is discharging into the Kellswater River, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because the water that comes out of this pipe is mostly clean. It has been through a treatment plant, it's had most of the nasties removed, and what's coming out of here is mostly clean water. There are still some phosphates in it, which isn't ideal, but what is much worse is that there's more than one type of pipe in Northern Ireland like this, and the other type is a storm overflow pipe. There are 2,444 of those pipes. I know this because you can see them online. There's a map, and every year those pipes output 20 million tons of untreated sewage directly into our rivers, and in some cases directly into Lough Neagh. And the question is, why on earth does that happen? And the simple answer to it is that our sewage system is just not fit for purpose. And when you get really heavy rainfall, a little bit like today, a lot of that rainwater ends up in the sewage system, it ends up in the treatment plants, the tanks reach capacity, there's nowhere for the extra water and sewage to go, and so it simply gets pumped into the rivers. And the reason for that is that our government run and owned water service here in Northern Ireland has been chronically underfunded and underinvested in for decades. So next time you're taking a poop during a particular heavy rainstorm, just remember that somewhere a fisherman might be seeing it floating past. And while we're on the subject of poo, that brings me neatly to septic tanks. Because our sewage system is so old here and not big enough, 14% of all residencies in Northern Ireland are not even on the sewage network, which means they have to have septic tanks. There are around 10,000 septic tanks around Lough Neagh. These need to be desludged on a fairly regular basis. That's a great phrase. And if they're not, and if they're really old, they're not maintained properly, they start to leak. And a lot of that waste, a lot of that sewage ends up going into the groundwater and making its way into the rivers and into Lough Neagh. And in fact, about 10% of the excess nutrients in Lough Neagh come from these leaky septic tanks. And then we have the issue of industry. So you remember that not fit for purpose sewage system I just mentioned? Well, it also has to deal with the wastewater from industry, or trade effluent as it's known. And trade effluent is supposed to meet certain standards of volume and also the amount of sort of nutrients and chemicals and things that are in that water. But the problem is that all too often those standards aren't met. All of this is just putting more and more pressure on our aging sewage system that can't keep up, and means that it's more and more likely for those discharges to end up directly in rivers and waterways. And the total impact of our insufficient sewage system is that 24% of the excess nutrients in Lough Neagh are coming from wastewater. Next up, we have sand dredging, and this practice has been going on for centuries in Lough Neagh. Every year, 1.5 million tons of this stuff is dredged up from the loch bed, and the industry says it's restricted to a certain area and it doesn't have any impact. Environmental campaigners, on the other hand, say that's just not true. There is some kind of impact, and at the very least, it's releasing nutrients from the loch bed that would have otherwise remained locked up. But to be honest, the most controversial part about this is that the rights to dredge that loch bed are owned by the Earl of Shaftesbury. They've been in his family for 200 years. Before that, they were owned by the Chichesters, who owned quite a lot of land in Ireland. Not very popular here, and they gained control of Lough Neagh by killing the locals. In fact, in 1601, Sir Arthur Chichester, after a raid across Lough Neagh, said this: "We have burned and destroyed along the loch, and even within 4 miles of Dungannon, where we killed man, woman, child, horse, beast, and whatever we find." So, as you can imagine, a posh English bloke owning any part of Lough Neagh today, for that reason, is not a popular idea. But there is a little bit more to say on that later. And that brings us to agriculture, which is the most controversial, emotional, and ideologically charged contributing factor. It's controversial because some people feel that farmers have been used as scapegoats in all of this. It's emotional because when you attack farming, you attack a very way of life. And it's ideological because some people would be quite happy to see the end of the dairy and meat industry completely. So, much in the same way as if you're walking through a field of cows, I'm going to tread carefully here because this is a complex issue and I want to be as fair as possible. What do you think, girls? Are they girls? Oh, yep. Yep, they're girls. And unfortunately, it turns out that agriculture is the biggest contributor of the phosphorus pollution in Lough Neagh, and the source of that pollution is mostly right there. Animal waste down in the country, they call it dung. In the city, it's manure, but that waste, that poop, that plop, that cow patty, whatever you want to call it, is often spread on the fields in a liquefied form known as slurry. And slurry is an excellent fertilizer. We've been using it for centuries, including at one point our own. Did you know that? At one point in time, a man would come round to your house to collect your pots of night soil to go and spread it on your fields. Thankfully, we don't do that anymore, but we do spread a lot of cow slurry. And the problem is, farmers are only supposed to spread slurry during dry conditions, and they're only allowed to spread it during certain months of the year. The problem with that is, it rains here a lot, and our weather is incredibly unpredictable. So there are rarely totally ideal conditions for spreading slurry. And also quite often, some of those ideal conditions occur during the months when they're not actually allowed to spread. So a lot of slurry ends up getting spread when it maybe shouldn't be spread, or because the farmer's got so much excess slurry, they end up spreading a little bit more than they should, and that ends up getting washed into the rivers. And then we do have to acknowledge the fact that there are some irresponsible farmers who do not want to pay for the expense of disposing of it properly, or just don't care, who have dumped slurry directly into rivers. This causes massive problems. Now, there aren't massive fines for really bad offences like this. £20,000 and up to 2 years in prison, but those higher penalties rarely happen. And I think that's possibly because what judge wants to destroy an essential, vital local business and tear apart a small family who have been, benefiting society for generations? So a sad fact here is that the majority of farms could not survive if not for government subsidies. So they have to follow whatever schemes are connected to the most funding. So in 2014, the government launched Going for Growth, and this was a scheme designed to almost double the size of the agri-food market here, increase exports and improve the economy. And as always, financial incentives were used to encourage farmers to take part, and it was massively successful. Farms expanded, food output and exports increased, and the economy got a boost from that. But suddenly you have all these farms with twice the number of animals they had just a few years ago, which meant that twice as much waste and twice as much slurry was being produced. And not enough forward planning had gone into figuring out, well, what's going to happen with that? And as you'd probably expect, the result of this was that more agricultural runoff ended up in drainage ditches, ended up in rivers, and ended up getting into Lough Neagh. And this may have been the final straw that broke the camel's back. Because in the summer of 2023, that combination of warmer, clearer water, the impacts from sand dredging, our insufficient, not fit for purpose sewage system, impacts from industrial practices and from agriculture, all came together to mean that Lough Neagh was a ticking nutrient time bomb, and as a time bomb that was set off by the first heat wave of last summer. And the big question you're all waiting to have the answer to is, who exactly do we blame for this? And to answer that question, I'm going to need to sit down. And unfortunately, there is no simple answer to that question because no one person or group is entirely to blame, but really the bulk of the responsibility lies with decades of poor political decisions, poor planning, and bad communication. In other words, incompetence, and mostly political incompetence. For over 50 years, we've known what would happen if we didn't do something, and yet no government seems to have taken the responsibility, taken the initiative to make it their problem and take the popularity hit from maybe having to divert resources or money from other places and help fix this issue. And that's why it feels like a little bit of a cover-up. The truth, the facts, the things we knew were hidden, either deliberately or accidentally, and in a lot of cases it seems like they were just willfully ignored. And instead, the decisions that got the priority were those aimed at boosting the economy, adding a little bit more money into each of our pockets. And let's be honest, that's probably because if we'd been told that money was going to be taken away from jobs, from education, from the arts, from culture, from health, from agriculture, from industry, and all for the sake of dealing with what is essentially a poo problem, it probably wouldn't be that popular a vote winner around election season. So in a way, you could argue that we're all to blame for saying that we care about the environment, and pretty much everybody does, but not really been willing to pay the price from doing something actually meaningful about it.
As for the solution to all this, well, reports have been commissioned, steps have been suggested to be taken, and on paper it looks like something is being done, although frustratingly a lot of the things they're suggesting are things that actually could have been done decades ago. One place there has been some positive change is on the ownership of the loch, because the Earl of Shaftesbury has decided to do the right thing and hand over those rights.
How much of a difference that's going to make, we don't really know, because whoever owns a loch doesn't really have any control over the stuff that goes into it, so...
But conversations are happening. The Earl was over in Belfast recently, and to thank him for doing the right thing, protesters threw a bottle of water from Lough Neagh, which, like, what did that achieve? Anyway, but at least it does seem that maybe some positive changes are on the way. But if I don't seem incredibly happy about this, here's why. Even if all sources of pollution going into Lough Neagh stopped today, it would take 40 years. 40 years for the water quality to go back to being good. It's almost the same amount of time that we've known how to prevent this, and that is just tragic.
So why do I care about all of this? I'm just some random guy who likes to make outdoor adventure videos on YouTube. This isn't the usual kind of content I make. Well, I don't know, I just felt like making it because to me, I see this world as a gift, and it's a gift that we've been given to enjoy and also to use for our own benefit and our own flourishing. But at the same time, we have a responsibility to protect it and look after it. And if we don't do that, we're not going to be able to enjoy and benefit from it the way we should. On a less pretentious philosophical level, I'm very upset that the paddleboarding community on Lough Neagh that I'd become part of every summer and enjoyed going out on weekday and weekends has completely ceased to exist. And I've even got friends who have paddleboarding businesses that have been massively affected by all this as well. And that's kind of one of the things. Stuff like this always affects the little guy the most. It's always the small businesses and the individuals that come out the worst in this. It's the individuals who can't go on the loch anymore. It's those smaller businesses that can't perform anymore. Whereas the big industry, they go on. The water companies, they go on. You know, the large, rich farmers are fine. They're protected. So that's kind of frustrating.
There is so much more could be said about all aspects of this, and no doubt I've got a few things wrong here and there, but I hope at the very least it provokes discussion. If you want to follow along and other things I'm doing, you can follow me on Instagram, you can subscribe on here, or if you want, you can go over to Patreon where you can sign up for free email updates. But thank you for watching. Hope you got something from this, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.
Any thoughts on your contribution to the blue-green algae crisis, ma'am? No comment.